Raising the Conversation, Season 3, Tomorrow's Church, a podcast by the MacRae Centre for Faith and Culture at Acadia Divinity College, with your host Joel Murphy, facilitator of trend research and analysis here at the MacRae Centre.
Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm excited for today's conversation. It's going to be an interesting one, as we were just chatting about. I think it's going to be a little bit of live time figuring it out. But today I'm very excited to welcome Reverend Dr. Ken Fu. He's the Director of Church Life and Leadership within the Canadian Baptist of Ontario and Quebec. I've had a lot of opportunities to interact with Ken and in his role, and I've really appreciated his wisdom and his insights. And today we're going to chat a little bit about the diversity that we're seeing within the church and how can we be faithful in responding not only in today's generation but also in the future. And so maybe Ken, if you could introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and then we can hop into the conversation.
Sure. Hi, my name is Ken, and as Joel said, I'm with the Canadian Baptist of Ontario, Quebec, serving as the Director of Church Life and Leadership. Really, it's about supporting and resourcing our pastors and church leaders well so that they can have healthy churches. And so a lot of conversations are always around how to equip pastors well and how to equip churches well. And I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think it's going to be something that we're learning along in this journey.
Oh yeah, it's a learning. Yeah, I appreciate that. The learning, we are in the midst of learning. And so I think maybe we just hop into it and think about, we know that there's a trend, the increased trend in immigration and diversity within Canada is established. Increasingly, Canadian centers across Canada, not just in large urban centers, but here in Atlantic Canada, Moncton's the fastest growing city in Canada, and that's largely due to new people coming to Canada from different countries. So we know this is a big piece in our Canadian landscape. And it's also very important in our context of church. So our churches are increasingly becoming more diverse and representative of the communities that they're in. And so I guess the question I have for you is, what are you learning about that? How is your team wrestling with that? And then I know that you have some background in the Chinese church in Toronto. What are the connections and learnings that you've had from your context that you think might be relevant to the broader Canadian church?
Sure. I think one of the first things that our team wrestles with is sometimes the language we have about what is a Canadian church, what is a diverse church, and even what sometimes, for lack of a better term, we say an ethnic church. And so we actually wrestle a lot with this because we're not quite sure if the word ethnic church or ethnicity is the correct term to use when identifying a church, especially if it's a church that has a cultural group or a language group, and they don't quite fit what we would call a Canadian church. And that term itself, we wrestle with too, because what does it mean to be a Canadian church? And so in the midst of an increasing immigration and in the midst of a diversification of our populations due to culture and people coming from different parts of the world, the language that we're struggling with, it seems like there is one image in people's mind about what a Canadian church is, and then everything else is different as a result. Within it, how do you, like, certain churches will have practices that are very similar to our quote-unquote Canadian church. It's just because the language is different. So does that disqualify them as a Canadian church? So this is a learning piece, and it's the hardest piece, I think, because when we have bad language to something, we tend to practice things in a negative way, or we shift things in a very negative way. And at the same time, you don't want to say the wrong thing for fear of offending anyone. So we're trying to find sort of the right way. So right now, what we've landed on so far is, if we're going to talk about a church, we simply just have to say, this is the name of the church. Or if there's a cultural piece to the church, then we just name what that culture is. So when we talk about a Korean church, we'll talk about a Korean church. When we say a rural church, we'll say a rural church. And when we say a Spanish-speaking congregation, we'll say Spanish-speaking congregation. So we're just going to use those identifiers instead of just saying Canadian or diverse or ethnic.
Right.
That's kind of what we're on, but we don't know if that's going to land yet.
And why? And we're going off our questions, but I think that's okay. Like, why could you speak to the like the importance of the language piece? Because I feel like that's something that we might miss in terms of like the power of like language has so much power. And when talking about engaging in diverse spaces and across differences, just because of differing worldviews, different experiences growing up, all these pieces, like that's somebody's experience. Like one of my good friends who I grew up with is Ethiopian. His experience growing up was very different in Ethiopia, and having an Ethiopian family was very different than my experience growing up in Winnipeg with my Ukrainian Mennonite background. Like, why then is language so important when around this topic of engaging in and considering what it means to be a diverse church and the importance of that for the future?
I think the hard part with the language is whether or not it creates labels, and as a result of those labels creates division. So if we're not careful if we use too many labels, then we create too many divisions. And of course, in churches and in the kingdom picture, the idea of coming together and unity is key to what Jesus has always said. So are we separating ourselves with unnecessary language, or are we trying to bring ourselves together with proper language? And then sometimes it depends on who's creating the language. And so the issue that we'll have is, one group will say, this is the dominant, this is the right way, this is the only way. And everyone needs to come towards that. And so there creates these power dynamics and shifts. So if you don't have proper language to things, you can again create further division through power dynamics, saying, well, this is the context, this is the Canadian context, therefore that's the way to do things in Canada. Whereas, if you come from another background, you are now second tier or third tier because you don't meet that same standard. So that's the challenge I think that we have with the language.
Yeah. Yes. I think that, and that speaks to me a little bit around the value of something like intercultural humility, or the will of relationship. Like, how do we, within our congregations or within our different spaces, how do we move towards each other with a sense of curiosity, and not just like my perspective is the right perspective and you need to fit into that, versus what can I learn from you in terms of what your experience, your background, but also then what can I offer, is like this mutuality, I suppose, seems to be a big crux of what you were just talking about.
Yeah, definitely.
So and so then thinking about the kind of a little switch, but with your background in working in the Chinese church in Toronto, I know there were probably a lot of lessons, and again, we'll stumble through this in terms of the proper language, and because recognizing that every culture is different, right? So like Chinese culture and the dynamics and the experiences there are very different than like my Ukrainian Mennonite background, and might be different from others. So recognizing that, are there lessons that you think can be learned from like the Chinese church in Toronto that could support churches across Canada, as you think about whether it's about like increased diversity, and specifically thinking about generations, like how faith is transmitted across generations? Just wondering if there's kind of broad like learnings that you think are relevant from that space.
Yeah, I think I don't want to go in too much of a history lesson, but you'd have to kind of take a step back to how did the Chinese churches start, and especially with the Canadian Baptists. We have a lot of our Chinese churches are part of the Canadian Baptist family, and some of our biggest churches actually are in the Canadian Baptist family. And so when we talk about the Chinese Baptist Church in Canada, and especially in the Greater Toronto area, you're talking about churches that started in about the 1960s, and there was this immigration influx of people coming from Hong Kong, especially. And in Hong Kong, it was of course a British colony at that time, And so there was very much a sense of understanding some westernization, and at the same time coming to Canada, which was also, part of the British Empire, right? Like there's that just that ease of coming to another culture. But the language was Cantonese. And so you have a group of people who come to Canada, they come with whatever they have, they make a life for themselves as immigrants. And as they settle into Canada, they have children who are born and raised in the Canadian context now, in the Canadian school systems, in places that are not pockets of necessarily being Cantonese speaking from Hong Kong, but are quote unquote just Canadian, as we try to say. So now, so for someone like myself whose parents are immigrants, and the funny thing for me is that my parents are actually immigrants from Malaysia, which is a totally different context, different culture, different place in the world. And they came to Canada and they settled in the Chinese church because it was a place of commonality where you had common language and common faith, and you could express your faith in the language that you were most comfortable with, your heart language. And you didn't try to, praying to Jesus in your mother tongue is much more simply than when you're praying to Jesus when English is your second language. But the challenge is then, as my parents came and as they had kids like me and my brothers, they would develop English congregations to say, how do we have faith transmitted from one generation to another if our kids don't know the language, the heart language that we know? Because I grew up in the Canadian school system where English was the first language taught, French was the second language, and the occasional family will send their kids to Chinese school one day out of the week on the weekend. So my heart language is going to be English. And so if preaching, I couldn't understand Cantonese, I didn't understand the language. And if preaching wasn't given in my language, how would I hear the gospel, right? So they created these English congregations. But one of the challenges with these congregations that get created is you just simply create the structures and the systems of the previous congregation, the Cantonese congregation, even though it's culturally different, and you impose that upon the next congregation, the English congregation, which then has to meet the same systems and structures, but it's a different culture. And sometimes those things don't connect well. All the while, the dominant culture has been this Cantonese Hong Kong culture, which honor your father and mother is a very important aspect of it. So you don't question the authority. You kind of just go with what it's supposed to be. And to question it is not a good thing. Fast forward now, here we are in 2020s. And, what has shifted is that in the early 2000s, China opened its doors. So mainland China opened its doors, and people were leaving mainland China, coming to Canada, and they speak a different language, even though they're considered Chinese, and they speak Mandarin. And now you have another influx of people coming who look the same, but speak a different language, have a different culture, because mainland China is very different from Hong Kong, and is also different from us as next gen English Canadian, Canadian-born Chinese is what we say. So now you're wrestling with three cultures under one roof with three of the similar structures and ways of doing things, but it is still very different cultures altogether. And so that's been the experience in the Greater Toronto area with these trilingual churches, English, Cantonese, and Mandarin. And again, Mandarin from China, you're talking about like 1 billion people, right? And that's statistically, it's huge. And Hong Kong being a much smaller place, yet they're the dominant culture of the Chinese church. And then you have the English culture, which is trying to bring in the children and the teenagers of the Mandarin congregation, the children and teenagers of the English congregation, and then me having my own children and teenagers of the English congregation in a quote unquote Canadian context where when I grew up with all different kinds of people. And I'm being told, invite them to church, tell them about Jesus. But my Black friends, South Asian friends, my Caucasian friends don't understand what a Chinese church looks like or how it works. And they come in, they see all these Chinese people, even though I'm Canadianized, And what do you do with that? So here we are now with all these different generations trying to figure out multiculturalism, trying to figure out how, though people look the same, it's different cultures, and you're pulling that all together in this thing called the church. It's phenomenal, and it's beautiful, but it's also frustrating.
Yes, that it just highlights the complexity of it, right?
Yeah.
Is there that's really helpful. Like, are there ways or examples where you think you've seen success, where there's been success of the ways that like those like language like churches have been able to work together in terms of honoring and recognizing each other's the differences across the different populations, but also like the kind of that unity that we have in Christ together?
Yeah, I think every church, like even in the Chinese churches in the Greater Toronto area, everyone's trying to figure out different ways to do it. Some have gone with the whole, let's be three congregations, three separate churches, three separate entities sharing resources, sharing one budget, sharing one roof, sharing one building, right? Like people have tried that. People have said, let's work at the whole thing of just being harmonious with one another. And so everything is compromised. You give some, we give some, you give some, so nobody gets what they want fully, but for the sake of unity, you are making compromises all the time. And so there have been successes, there have been failures, there have been good things and bad things to go with it. There hasn't been one, I don't think, quote unquote, right approach to it all. I think it really depends on your leadership. It depends on the vision you've set as a church. Because again, one of the unique things, even in the Greater Toronto area, is you can still have pockets of people who culturally will speak one language and live in a particular area. So in Toronto, anyone who lives in sort of that what's called Richmond Hill, Scarborough area, there's a dominant culture of people who speak Cantonese still in those areas. So does a church need to shift anything to meet the community? Not much. But where I grew up in the west side of Toronto in a place called Brampton, which is predominantly South Asian. And in being in a Chinese church in a South Asian community, how are you reaching people? The community looks different from the church itself. So what do you do with that? And my most recently, I grew up in Brampton, but I moved and now live in Mississauga, a western suburb of Toronto. And the fastest growing population here is that Middle Eastern population where most people speak Arabic, Persian. And what are we doing to meet people there in with the gospel? And so if you have these language churches in particular cities that have a different dominant culture, now you're going to wrestle with this whole diversity question still, but also wrestling within your church with your own diversity questions still.
Right.
And so that's the great challenge that goes with it.
Huh. I think it's so like helpful and obviously important because it touches everything, right? Like you were talking about, like there's obviously demographic shifts, but then that affects the way that as a church congregation it affects every aspect, right? Whether it's witnessing, like evangelism, the way we preach, the lessons, like the way that we share, the way we do community, like it's this whole. It affects every aspect, or at least it should, and with again being intentional with thought and prayer, just to consider the positive impacts that increased diversity could have on a congregation and a church.
Yeah.
I feel like we could talk about it forever, but I want to respect the time, and I guess like to kind of close things off, and it could be related to the topic we're talking about, or it could be just broadly like. When thinking about the future church, like where do you find hope? Where are you excited today or hopeful?
What I find hope is I think in the grand scheme and how the big picture in the book of Revelation, that every tribe, tongue, language, and nation comes together to worship at the throne. I think we catch a glimpse of that here in our Canadian context, that we don't necessarily have to be flying off to another part of the world to see that the world comes to Canada. And I think there's something to embrace in that. And that gives me a lot of hope and encouragement because it's a beautiful picture. The hope is also then how do we have a good sense of, I guess, intercultural humility? I think, and that's the term you use, a good intercultural humility, where we are engaging with people who may not look like us, have a different worldview, have a different language, a different culture, and yet what's beautiful is that the gospel speaks into all that. And but the question is, what is that gospel that we're preaching, right? And so sometimes I think what is scary is that that gospel that we preach, it gets shifted a bit based on our cultural nuances that go with it. And so now, I mean, we get into where we can talk about the ideas of, being a little more conservative in our thinking or being more liberal in our thinking. And of course, if people are coming from other parts of the world that are still quote unquote conservative in their thinking, what does that mean for our churches in this context? And if sometimes we can be seen as too liberal to some cultures. And at the same time, I guess I wrestle with when Jesus talks about we're in the world, not of the world.
Right.
And what does that mean for us moving forward? Because, this Canadian context that we find ourselves in, there's parts of it that are conservative, there's parts of it that are liberal. There are people who have been here for generations, and there are people who are just stepped off the boat, as we say, right? And so what does it mean to put all that together? And the hope is, and what I find is, Christ speaks into all of them. But are we directing people to Christ? Or are we directing people to an ideology? Are we directing people to what we think is right? Or are we directing people to really who Christ really is? So that's what gives me hope, because he's the great equalizer that brings this all together. But it's also where the challenge is, are we proclaiming the right Christ? And who determines that? Well, Christ himself, right? But who determines that, right?
Oh, I really appreciate that. I think that's the perfect spot to conclude, and I think that it just feels to me like it's the start of a conversation around, right? Like, how do we? It's almost like this reflexivity piece. Like, how do we continue to learn and grow and engage with difference, not for the sake of our own like proving ourselves right, but to learn and be able to grow in our understanding. Like, how has our image of like in the quote unquote Canadian church been informed by the European Western perspective? And then are there ways, like, I think an easy low hanging fruit is like individualism versus collectivism, right? Like that's the fruit that a lot of like the Western context is very individualized and it's all about, but we see that in from different cultural perspectives, like it's a collectivist, it's a work together, we're for each other more so. And like, what opportunity for again, you're right, how do we define Canadian? It feels silly, but like the predominantly Western church, what are, like, there's so much learning opportunities from that. And I think all with that Christ, because Jesus is that equalizer, which I think is powerful.
As you said that, one thought, as you talk about individualism or collectivism, and one aspect of the gospel that I think that's very unique to a quote unquote Canadian Western type of culture versus some of the other parts of the world is also, how do we recognize sin? Like we see sin as this individual thing, a guilt and innocence thing in our Canadian Western way of thinking. Whereas in other parts of the world, sin is this issue of shame and collective shame that filters not only to the individual person, but to the entire family unit, right? And so shame and guilt, like those two things, again, part of the gospel narrative that we're telling people about, that Christ died for our sins, right? But for some of us, that's a very individual guilt, innocence type of image, versus others of us, it's a very shame collective and a very different way to deal with sin. So it's just, as you said that, it just reminded me of that conversation I had not too long ago too, that I thought was interesting.
Yeah, wow. We need to wrap up. But like, is there like, what is kind of like low hanging fruit that you would recommend church leaders to like to engage in this type of thinking or like thinking around this? Like, is there kind of like what could people do as like kind of faithful next steps to be like, okay, I know this is something that's happening. I know this is obviously an important part for me to think about. Like, but what are like those immediate, but it can feel a little bit overwhelming, particularly if like you're in a context where you haven't engaged cross culturally a whole lot. What are like kind of low hanging like steps that people could take possibly to move towards understanding and growing in this area?
I think it's helpful that if someone comes into your context that's from a different background, different culture, that we take a posture more of listening, a posture more of learning, to ask questions to develop insight rather than to, rather than a interrogative type question where why are you here, or like what is your purpose of coming to this church, and kind of feeling, but tell me more about how God has been working. Tell me more as to what brought you here. Help me understand how you hear things, how you see things, and more of those probing questions that help us understand another person's perspective, another person's worldview. I don't think it's too far off from how many of us probably have to do evangelism moving forward. Like, we just need to listen to where a person's coming from first. And then the subtle nudges or the opportunities to nudge people in a different direction with the gospel. So it's more that posture of listening for learning and for understanding, rather than come from a position of authority and being right and saying this is the way it should be. So I think if we can start with that, I think that'll always be the best starting point.
Oh, it's amazing. It starts with relationship. All right. Thanks. Thank you, Ken. Really appreciate this.